The night the numbers screamed. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment if you dare. Because once you step inside this story, the only thing more dangerous than the criminals is the truth they tried to bury. The alarms did not scream. The sirens did not wail. There was no masked figure sprinting through a marble hallway clutching a bag of stolen gold. Instead, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the numbers began to lie. In a reinforced underground chamber beneath the capital's central bank, a single analyst named Elena Vargas stared at her screen and felt the air leave her lungs. The digits in front of her flickered, rearranged themselves, and then settled into a configuration that made no sense at all. Billions were missing. Not transferred. Not withdrawn. Not hacked in the way hacks usually happened. Just gone. The room around her hummed with the low, constant vibration of servers the size of refrigerators, stacked like steel monoliths in rows that disappeared into shadow. Blue indicator lights blinked in calm, steady rhythms, as if everything was fine. As if the financial heart of an entire nation was not quietly bleeding out behind a wall of encrypted silence. Elena stood slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass of the server casing, pale, wide-eyed, lips slightly parted like she had forgotten how to breathe. She whispered, "That's not possible." But the numbers did not care what was possible. Within minutes, her emergency call climbed the hierarchy like fire climbing dry wood. First her supervisor. Then the head of cybersecurity. Then, quietly and without fanfare, a call placed directly to a black, unmarked phone on the desk of the Minister of Finance. By dawn, the city woke up to rumors. By noon, the markets trembled. By sunset, the nation realized something had happened that could not be undone easily, if at all. Because what had vanished was not just money. It was trust. The men who didn't rob banks. They would later call it Operation Silent Vault, but in those first hours, no one knew what to call it. The authorities refused to say the word attack. The politicians avoided the word theft. And the banks, terrified of causing panic, released a carefully phrased statement blaming a temporary systems irregularity. But the truth was far uglier. A small, invisible gang had done something no criminal syndicate had ever done before. They didn't rob a bank. They didn't storm a vault. They didn't threaten anyone with guns or bombs. They rewrote reality. Somewhere beyond borders and cameras, they had forged sovereign debt records, manipulated digital reserves, and quietly erased the economic fingerprints that proved the country even owned what it claimed. It was like waking up one morning and discovering your name had been deleted from your own birth certificate, not altered, not crossed out, but cleanly erased as if it had never existed at all. And nobody knew who had done it. Enter the investigator. 3 hours after Elena's call, a man named Daniel Rourke stood inside the central bank's underground data hall, his long coat draped over one arm, eyes scanning the quiet rows of machines. Rourke was not flashy. No sharp suits. No dramatic speeches. Just a former financial crimes prosecutor turned intelligence consultant, with tired eyes and a reputation for understanding crimes that did not look like crimes at all. He knelt beside Elena's workstation, listening as she tried to explain what she had seen. "They didn't break anything," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. "There was no intrusion alert, no malware signature. It's like they were already inside." Rourke's jaw tightened. "That's because they probably were." He pulled on a pair of gloves and began scrolling through encrypted system logs, his fingers moving with the calm precision of a surgeon. The more he read, the darker his expression became. "This isn't a hack," he said quietly. "This is a rewrite." Elena stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means someone didn't steal your money," he replied. "They stole your proof. And without proof, money is just a story people agree to believe." The first clue. By the end of the first day, panic had been replaced with controlled chaos. International calls flooded in. Credit agencies demanded explanations. Foreign investors began pulling out quietly, like guests slipping away from a party that suddenly feels unsafe. Meanwhile, Rourke and a small, sealed-off task force began tracing the impossible. They followed trails that should not exist, fragments of digital signatures hidden inside transaction metadata, ghost entries buried beneath layers of encryption, and tiny discrepancies in timestamp patterns that revealed something artificial beneath the surface. It was one of those patterns that led them to the first true clue: a repeating anomaly. Every manipulated record, no matter how different the transaction, carried a microscopic timestamp delay of exactly 9 milliseconds. 9 milliseconds was nothing in human time. But in machine time, it was a fingerprint. A signature. Someone, somewhere, had built a system that could forge reality, and had left behind the faintest trace of its presence, like the smell of smoke long after the fire has been extinguished. Rourke leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall as the realization sank in. This wasn't done by a country, he said. This wasn't even done by a cartel. Then who? Elena asked. Rourke looked at her. Someone who doesn't want to be seen at all. The first name. It took 3 days for a name to surface. Not a suspect. Not a face. A legend. The architect. Whispered in intelligence circles. Referenced in dark corners of cybercrime forums. A figure associated with systems so advanced they blurred the line between criminal and state-level operations. No one knew who the architect was, or if it was even one person. Some believed it was a collective. Others thought it was a single mind with resources rivaling governments. What they all agreed on was this: where the architect's systems appeared, reality tended to break. Rourke stared at the name on the file, the room around him silent except for the low hum of electronics. If the architect was involved, then this was not about money. It was about power. The human cost. On the 4th day, the first visible crack appeared. A mid-sized manufacturing firm announced it could no longer meet payroll due to liquidity uncertainties. Then another. Then a chain reaction began. People who had never heard of digital reserves or sovereign debt suddenly felt the crime in their bones. In missed paychecks, frozen accounts, rising prices, and whispers of layoffs. A crime without guns was tearing through lives just as brutally. Rourke visited one of the affected neighborhoods that evening, standing quietly on a street where shops were closing early and conversations had become hushed and suspicious. A woman locked her store while glancing nervously down the road. 2 men argued in low voices outside a shuttered cafe. The fear was not loud, it was suffocating. And the criminals responsible were nowhere to be seen. A race against time. Back at the task force headquarters, pressure mounted with every hour. Foreign governments demanded answers. The media smelled blood. And somewhere inside the system, the silent vault remained open. They discovered that the digital architecture used to manipulate the records was modular, designed to spread, adapt, and vanish without leaving a central command point. Which meant even if they found part of it, the rest could escape. Rourke stood over a digital map projected across the wall, lines and nodes pulsing like a living organism. This isn't a robbery, he said. It's a demonstration. A demonstration of what? Elena asked. That a nation can be erased, he replied, without ever touching it. The shocking discovery. Late on the 6th night, when exhaustion had settled into their bones and hope was wearing thin, one of the junior analysts called out from across the room. I found something, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rourke walked over slowly. On the screen was a buried file, hidden beneath layers of obfuscation so deep it was practically a digital grave. The file name was meaningless. The contents were not. It was a mirror ledger. A complete, hidden duplicate of the nation's financial identity, every reserve, every debt, every asset, all stored and manipulated outside official systems. Not just stolen data. A stolen country. Rourke felt a chill crawl up his spine as the implication became clear. Someone wasn't just attacking the nation. They were preparing to replace it. And if that mirror ledger went live, the real one would cease to exist. Rourke straightened slowly, eyes locked on the screen. This isn't the crime, he said quietly. It's the prelude. And somewhere in the shadows, the thieves were still watching. The mirror that light. The mirror ledger was not supposed to exist. Yet there it was, glowing cold and precise across the wall of the task force command room, like a reflection that moved a fraction of a second too late. Every number matched the nation's official records, except they didn't belong to the nation anymore. They belonged to someone else. Daniel Rourke stood in front of it with his hands on his hips, staring at what felt like a digital corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. "This thing isn't just copying us," he said slowly. "It's rehearsing us." The room was silent. Outside, the Capitol buzzed with restless energy. Markets opened and closed in fear-driven spasms. Politicians smiled for cameras and whispered panic into secure phones. The public was told everything was under control. The system, however, was quietly slipping out of their hands. Because now they knew the truth. The gang behind Operation Silent Vault was not stealing a country. They were building a substitute. The second crime. The next strike came without warning. At 3:41 a.m., 3 continents away, a financial clearinghouse in Frankfurt detected an irregularity in a bond settlement tied directly to the compromised nation. Seconds later, an emergency alert flashed across the European Central Monitoring Network. The nation's sovereign bonds had just been sold. Not partially. Not illegally. Completely. On paper, the country had sold its future to someone who did not exist. By the time trading was halted, the damage was done. Pension funds froze. Credit lines vanished. A rumor spread through financial circles like a disease. The country was finished. Rourke received the alert on his phone while standing alone in the server chamber beneath the central bank, surrounded by machines that no longer belonged to anyone he could see. "They're moving it," he whispered. Elena rushed in moments later, her face pale. "We can't reverse it," she said. "The transaction trail is perfect. Whoever did this made it look like a legitimate state action." Rourke closed his eyes briefly. "They're not stealing money anymore," he said. "They're rewriting history in real time." Faces in the static. With each passing hour, the pressure intensified. Interpol demanded cooperation. Allied nations began quietly distancing themselves. Foreign investors prepared to flee. But what terrified Rourke most wasn't what the criminals were doing. It was how calmly they were doing it. No grand declarations. No digital graffiti. No messages or manifestos. Just silence. A silence that felt intentional, like a predator refusing to roar because it didn't need to. Then came the first human mistake. Buried deep inside the mirror ledger's architecture, Elena found a single data packet that didn't belong. It was small, insignificant in size, but impossibly out of place. A trace signal. A whisper. She isolated it and ran it through a signal deconstruction tool. What emerged was not a location, but a pattern. A routing behavior associated with one specific kind of infrastructure. A privatized satellite relay network. Rourke stared at the result. "That network isn't used by criminals," he said. "It's used by governments, and people pretending to be governments." For the first time since the crisis began, the hunt had a direction. The man who shouldn't exist. The name came back from a sealed intelligence archive that had not been accessed in over a decade. Marcus Hale. Officially, dead. Unofficially, erased. Hale had once been a systems architect for a multinational defense contractor, specializing in financial infrastructure security, the kind designed to withstand war. Brilliant. Paranoid. Obsessive about redundancies. Then, after uncovering classified operations that blurred the line between economic control and warfare, he vanished. No body. No funeral. No confirmation. Just silence. Rourke leaned over the file, his voice low. If Hale is alive, then Silent Vault isn't just criminal. It's ideological. What kind of ideology steals a country? Elena asked. The kind that believes countries shouldn't exist in the first place, Rourke replied. The vanishing witness. Before they could move on Hale's trail, the criminal struck again. A mid-level official at the Ministry of Finance, a man who had signed off on several digital security updates linked to the compromised systems, failed to arrive at work one morning. His phone was found abandoned in his apartment. His computer wiped clean. His bank accounts untouched. There was no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had stepped out of his life voluntarily, or had been lifted out without resistance. Rourke stood in the empty apartment later that night, scanning the neat living room, the framed family photos still aligned on the shelf. "They're cleaning the edges," he said quietly, "removing anyone who might blur their illusion." Elena swallowed. "Do you think he helped them?" "I think he helped build the door," Rourke replied, and then realized too late who was knocking. With time running out and international pressure mounting, Rourke made a dangerous decision. They would stop reacting. They would provoke. Using fragments of the mirror ledger's code, Elena constructed a decoy asset, a digital reserve designed to look like a vulnerable fragment of the nation's remaining financial identity. It was fake, but convincing enough to lure anyone monitoring the system. They planted it deep within the compromised architecture and waited. For 12 hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, the decoy moved. Not stolen. Not erased. Activated. A silent handshake protocol initiated from the satellite relay network. Rourke watched the data flow like a hunter watching fresh tracks appear in snow. "They took the bait," he said. The signal pointed toward a mobile command node. Not a building, not a country, but something far harder to pin down. A ship. Somewhere in international waters. A floating ghost. The ship without a flag. Naval intelligence confirmed it hours later. A massive, privately registered vessel had been drifting in a pattern that made no commercial sense, shutting off its transponder intermittently, reappearing only long enough to avoid suspicion. No flag. No declared cargo. No legitimate destination. But its internal network activity matched the trace signal exactly. Operation Silent Vault was not being run from a bunker or a city. It was being run from nowhere. A place beyond jurisdiction. Rourke stood in the Situation Room as the ship's image filled the main screen, a dark silhouette against endless water. "They're not hiding," he said. "They're daring us to come. The price of knowing." Before authorization could be secured to intercept the vessel, the cost of getting close became painfully clear. Elena's terminal went dark mid-analysis. A second later, her phone rang. She answered instinctively and froze. No voice. Just breathing. Then a calm, distorted whisper. "Some reflections are not meant to be touched." The line went dead. Rourke was at her side in seconds. "What did they say?" Elena's hands trembled. "They know who I am." Rourke felt the weight of it settle into his chest. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a confrontation. The unthinkable revelation. As emergency security protocols kicked in and Elena was escorted away, Rourke returned to the mirror ledger alone, studying its structure one final time. Something had been bothering him since the beginning. The system was too elegant. Too restrained. Too precise. This was not the work of criminals chasing profit. It was the work of someone proving a theory. And then he saw it. Hidden deep within the mirror ledger's core logic was a fail-safe condition. A trigger that would activate not when the criminals were threatened, but when the nation tried to reclaim control. A dead man's switch. If the country fought back too hard, the mirror would overwrite the original. Rourke stepped back slowly, the truth crashing over him. "They don't need to escape," he whispered. "They just need us to blink." And for the first time since Operation Silent Vault began, Daniel Rourke understood something far more terrifying than theft. They weren't trying to steal a nation. They were daring the world to decide if it deserved to keep one. The war without smoke. By the time the world realized there would be no negotiation, no ransom demand, no public declaration of victory, it was already too late for subtlety. Operation Silent Vault had crossed the line from crime into something colder. Not with bombs or borders, but with numbers, silence, and a single question hanging over every government office and trading floor. If a country can be overwritten without a single soldier crossing its borders, what does sovereignty even mean anymore? Daniel Rourke stood in the operations center beneath the Capitol, staring at the global map as if it were a chessboard whose pieces no longer obeyed the rules. Colored markers pulsed across continents, tracking market reactions, diplomatic movements, and the quiet, invisible tremors spreading through financial systems worldwide. Every decision now carried a terrifying possibility. Fight too hard, and the mirror ledger might activate, erasing the nation's financial identity in seconds. Do nothing, and the criminals would slowly replace reality with their own version of it. And somewhere in international waters, a ship without a flag was waiting. The countdown no one could see. The final warning came from an unexpected place. A minor trading platform in Southeast Asia collapsed in less than 8 minutes after a burst of anomalous transactions routed through the same satellite relay network. The damage was contained, but the message was unmistakable. The criminals were no longer just threatening. They were rehearsing the end. Rourke slammed his hand on the table. "They're testing scale," he said, "seeing how fast the world breaks when the numbers stop behaving." Around him, officials debated sanctions, covert strikes, cyber countermeasures, but none of them could solve the core problem. There was no enemy territory to invade, no army to confront, just a system that could make a nation disappear with a command no one could see coming. Then Elena, pale but steady after hours under protection, stepped forward with something no one expected. "There's a flaw," she said. The room went silent. She pulled up a schematic of the mirror ledger's architecture, layers of logic folding over each other like an intricate origami. "They built it to be perfect," she continued, "but perfection creates dependence. Everything runs through one principle, synchronization. The mirror and the real ledger must constantly align or the system destabilizes." Rourke's eyes narrowed. Meaning if we don't attack the mirror," Elena said, "but instead corrupt the synchronization itself, the mirror will start lying to its creators." A dangerous idea. A brilliant one. Turning the mirror. Instead of destroying the mirror ledger, they would poison it. Using controlled, microscopic inconsistencies, tiny delays, harmless rounding errors, fractional distortions, they began feeding false stability into the system. Nothing obvious. Nothing violent. Just enough to make the mirror subtly unreliable. A shadow deceiving its master. Hours passed. Then, from the ship in international waters, the criminals made their first mistake since the operation began. They corrected an error, which meant they were watching. Rourke leaned forward. "They're not autonomous anymore," he said. "They're responding manually." "They're scared," Elena whispered. "And fear makes people visible." The face behind the system. Signals intelligence traced the correction path through the satellite network to a secure node inside the vessel, a private internal subnet used only for command-level operations. With unprecedented international authorization, a covert cyber intrusion was launched. What they found was not a criminal gang crowded around glowing screens. It was 5 people, each seated alone in a dark, quiet room, surrounded by silence and code. And in the center of them all, in a private channel isolated from the rest, was a single figure. Marcus Hale. Older than the file photos. Thinner, but unmistakable. The man who had vanished from the world was alive, and had built one of his own. Rourke stared at the feed. "This was never about money," he said. Elena shook her head. "It's about control." "No, it was about something deeper." Hale had once helped design systems meant to protect nations. Now, he had built one that proved nations could be undone without touching them. A demonstration to the world. The final move. They had one chance. Not to destroy Hale's system, but to make him destroy it himself. Rourke authorized a single, calculated transmission into the ship's network, a message written not in threats or demands, but in data. They fed Hale a perfect simulation. A projection showing his mirror ledger activated, successfully replacing the nation's financial identity, only for global systems to reject it within minutes, cascading into a worldwide financial collapse that wiped out everything. Not just the target nation. Everyone. A world without trust. A world without currency. A world without order. The ultimate consequence of proving his point. They didn't say a word. They let the numbers speak. Silence on the water. For nearly 20 minutes, the ship transmitted nothing. No corrections. No countermeasures. No movement. Then a single signal emerged from the vessel, routed through the same silent channels that had once rewritten a nation. The mirror ledger shut down. Not partially. Completely. Every trace of it collapsed inward, its architecture dissolving like a dream dissolves at waking. the synchronization ceased, the dead man switch disarmed, and the nation's financial identity stabilized, scarred, shaken, but real. There were no cheers in the operations room, just exhalations. Long, trembling breaths from people who had been holding them for days. The aftermath that no one celebrated. Marcus Hale and the others aboard the ship were quietly detained days later, transferred through sealed agreements to places that would never appear on maps or news headlines. There was no public trial, no dramatic sentencing, no speeches about justice. Because the truth was too dangerous to fully reveal. Markets recovered. Governments reassured their citizens. Life returned to something that resembled normal. But nothing was the same. Every financial system in the world underwent silent restructuring. Every digital reserve was questioned. Every assumption about security was rewritten. Not because of what Hale had done, but because of what he had proven possible. The final twist. Weeks later, alone in his office, Daniel Rourke reviewed the final archived data from Operation Silent Vault. As he closed the file, something caught his eye. A fragment of code. Inactive. Isolated. Unlinked to any known system. It wasn't part of Hale's architecture. It was older. And it was embedded deep within the global financial protocol itself. A structure no one person could have built. Rourke stared at it, heart slowly sinking. Operation Silent Vault had not introduced the world to the idea that a nation could be erased without war. It had revealed that someone, somewhere, had already prepared the world for it long ago. And the scariest part wasn't that Silent Vault existed. It was that Silent Vault wasn't the first. And it wouldn't be the last. If this story shook you, you're not ready for what comes next. So hit subscribe, because the real crimes aren't always the ones you can see.